I'm going to be talking in a minute about elephants, even though this is a hominid symposium. But I'll just start by partly excusing myself on that, because there is actually a very interesting parallel between the latter part of the evolutionary history of hominids and elephants, in that they both had their main diversification in Africa, and about 7 million years ago, that date is based on both molecular and fossil evidence, both show two quite tightly grouped cladistic events. In the case of the elephants, it led to the three lineages of elephants, which ultimately became the Asian elephant, the mammoth, and the African elephant, and in the case of hominids, of course, it's Homo, Pan, and gorilla. And then, subsequently, there was a dispersal out of Africa somewhat earlier, as far as we understand it so far, in the elephants than in the hominids. The little star marks Bethlehem. Hope you noticed that little joke there. And it is obviously in the Levant, and it's in one of the important likely corridors of dispersal, both for hominins and other fauna, of course in both directions, but I'm concerned here with the out of Africa direction. The site was excavated in the 1930s up to 1940, and it is now completely underneath the urban centre of the town of Bethlehem, so completely inaccessible, which has made our restudy of the site difficult because you can't revisit it. This is actually Dorothea Bate, the British paleontologist, who was one of the people involved in the excavation, and in fact you can see an elephant tooth in situ there. And what my co-author Rivka Rabinovich found is that there is a tremendous amount of preserved archive material that has barely been studied, preserved both in London and in Jerusalem. Original reports of the excavators, unpublished reports, diaries. This, for example, is one of Dorothea Bates' diaries of the excavation. And then, of course, there was a series of publications, particularly Gardner and Bate, who identified industry at the site, and Hoya in 1958, who made a detailed study of the fauna. And just to show us an example, this is one of the many plans that survive within the archive. Mostly these are elephant bones that you see here. That's an elephant pelvis marked. And we've been able to mostly connect these with the specimens as they are conserved in the Natural History Museum in London. And indeed, there's a series of drawings that were made at different levels, and the bones and the lithics seem to have accumulated over about 7 metres of sediment. This is a section of the time, and just very briefly, although we no longer have access to the site, it appears to have been a kind of a karstic collapse structure, which then filled with sediment. And dating is also difficult for the same reason. But recently, caves in the same region have been studied, whose terrestrial infill begins at about 3.6 million and goes up to about 3 million years ago. It appears that this karstic system in this area was actually underwater until about 4 million years ago, and there was then an uplift which dried out these caves, and that's the point at which they started accumulating terrestrial material. We don't have direct evidence on that for Bethlehem, but this is by analogy with other caves in the same karstic system that have been studied recently. When Hoya described the fauna, he found several things. This is the faunal list down here, which indicated to him clearly that this was a Villafranchian sensu lato. Fauna, for example, there's Hipparion, which according to our current understanding has really disappeared from this region by about 2.5, 2.3 million years ago, and a very primitive kind of elephant, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, which he called Elephas planifrons, a species known from the Siwalik hills of India, which was reasonable at the time, 1958, when he made this study, which was really the only analogous kind of elephant outside of Africa that he could draw a comparison with. Other elements of the fauna that he found, I was particularly pleased to hear Luca Pandolfi on Thursday say that he thinks actually that the rhinoceros, which Hoyer identified as Etruscus, which fitted the Villafranchian age, but Luca told me that he thinks this is actually an older Pliocene species of rhino, which actually fits what I think on the basis of the elephants. Now, here comes the controversial bit, because there's a whole load of lithics that were found at the site as well, in the same levels as the fauna, and they were interpreted by Gardner and Bate in the 1930s as being artifacts. And if you read that, if they were artifacts, that statement at the bottom there would still be true. And in fact, not only the Near East, but I would suggest the whole world outside of Africa, if it were true. However, Desmond Clark in 1961 made a detailed study of these lithics and concluded that although they had some of the characteristics of artifacts, he thought that they were produced by pressure percussion rather than direct percussion. I'm not an archaeologist, but in other words, he thought that they could all be explained as having been naturally produced. Nonetheless, he actually did not rule out the presence of humans at the site, because Stekalis, who was the guy who ran the 1940 excavation, had described a number of broken bones belonging to small animals, bare marks of working. One piece had a polished edge and may be considered an awl. And in fact, even Desmond Clark accepted this, but these pieces have vanished. Clark said he didn't know where they were. They'd been described in 1940, and we have been unable to locate them. So they, I'm afraid, remain a mystery. Here's a close-up of some of the tools. Like I already said, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not commenting, but here they are, and they are being restudied by Erela Holgers. As far as the bone remains are concerned, these are the elephant bones, most of them. They are poorly preserved. They required a tremendous amount of consolidation at the time. The surface is flaked and degraded. So in terms of looking for anything like cut marks, although Rivka has looked, it's not really, can't really say one thing or the other about them, because if there had been anything, I think it would all have been invisible by now. But the elephant remains are important, both from the point of view of the evolution and dispersal of elephants, but also as potential for dating the site. This is an in situ molar, and there is this magnificent mandible, which immediately, as Hoyer perceived, is quite a primitive kind of elephant. It has a long, low ramus and a very strong symphysis. And then particularly, I've made a detailed study of the molars, which there are quite a number. Here's a couple of upper M3s. And these are very primitive elephant molars. It is a complete M3 with only 8 plates. The range is from 8 to 10. We have a very low crown. And actually, this is the most primitive fossil elephant that you will find anywhere outside of Africa, to my knowledge, anyway. And we've actually been able to reveal some specimens that have really kind of been hidden from view until now. In the collection, there are some large, pretty, shapeless lumps of sediment from the original excavation. This one showed a little bit of tooth enamel poking out at the top. And I was absolutely delighted when we got this from a CT scan. There's a complete lower M3 in there from the scan. I was able to take basic measurements, and there's another one similar. So it's actually, together with the mandible that was already exposed, that makes 3. Just a little background on where these elephants might sit. What Maglio said about elephant evolution is still broadly accepted today, that we have 3 main lineages. The family, as I said earlier, has its roots in Africa. We have the African elephant lineage, the Elephas lineage, which diversified in Africa before eventually coming north and eventually east into Southeast Asia, where it still survives. And of course the mammoth lineage, which came up into Europe at about 3 to 3.5 million years ago. And in fact, both the earliest Elephas and the earliest Mammuthus out of Africa are both between about 3 and 3.5 million years ago, as known thus far. That, I don't know if you could read it, but that is actually Elephas planiform. So that's where Hoyer thought the Bethlehem elephant might sit. And Elephas planifrons is known, apart from here, really only from the Siwalik Hills of India, from about 2.5 to 2 million years ago. However, we've actually got most of the original material of Elephas planifrons in our museum from the Faulkner and Hawkley collection. In fact, the Elephas planifrons is more advanced than the Bethlehem elephant, significantly so. I don't believe the Bethlehem elephant can be assigned to Elephas planifrons. It's got more lamellae up to 12 plus in its M3. It's also got a higher crown. I'll show you a graph that demonstrates this in a moment. The only other fossil Elephas really that it's worth comparing it with is Elephas echorensis from Africa, East Africa, Pliocene species, which is really the earliest species of Elephas which we know until now, dating from about 4 million years ago. And even that one actually is more advanced than the Bethlehem elephant, such as this specimen, for example, 12 to 13 plates in the M3, the hypsodont molar as well. Conversely, the Bethlehem elephant fits better early mammuthus. Early mammuthus from Africa is actually, the ones that we know of are actually more primitive in form than those early Elephas. This is Mammuthus subplanifrons from South Africa, which has 8 or 9 plates in its M3 and a very low crown. The earliest mammoth that we have in Europe, from about 3.5 million onwards, has a similar number of very low plates in the crown, but it has increased its crown height. And this graph really tries to put those data together. And I've got here the two main parameters really that are important in the taxonomy of these elephants, and that is the number of lamellae or plates in the molar and the hypsodonty. And here's Bethlehem at the top. And first of all, you can see what I was describing before, that it is more primitive than both Elephas planifrons and echorensis in both of those criteria. But in its plate number, it's similar to these early Mammuthus. In the hypsodonty, the Mammuthus shows an increase in hypsodonty from this earliest African one, which is as much as 6 million years old, to these ones from North Africa, which is a bit more Africanibus, and ones from Hadar here, which I think are the closest fit to Bethlehem, and then the earliest ones in Europe are already a little bit more advanced. And this Hadar material is between about 4 and 3 million years ago. Africanibus is poorly dated, but probably about 3 million. And there are some other features, more detailed morphological features of the Bethlehem elephant molars, which link them, in my view, to Mammuthus rather than to Elephas, particularly the presence of a very strong posterior conule on the anterior lamellae, which you can see in these early Mammuthus here. So, if I'm right about that, that places the Bethlehem elephant somewhere around here, between about 4 and 3 million years ago, in the early evolution of Mammuthus, and that's based on the molars. But then there's Bethlehem has a bit of a puzzle for us, because there's also a tusk. What we've rather playfully done here is that we've actually superimposed a photograph of the tusk as it is in the collection today, with the site drawing from back in the day when they actually found it in situ. And you can sort of see the shape of it. It fits rather nicely there. But we had a very good look at this tusk and also CT scanned it. The distal third of it here is very damaged, and it's formed this kind of zigzag shape, which is certainly not natural. It's due to breakage and then sticking back together again. But I'm very confident that the proximal 2/3 of the tusk, which is about 1 metre in length, is pretty much undistorted. And it shows gentle curvature in one plane only. The significance of this is that if you think about the tusk of an Asian or an African elephant, it is a simple curve in one plane only, but the mammoth, of course, has this characteristic twisted tusk, which you see right back through to the earliest Mammuthus subplanifrons from South Africa. It's a characteristic of the genus. And, this is actually This picture at bottom right here is based on photogrammetry. It is just a kind of a front view, and it's to show that there's absolutely no sign of this of a three-dimensional twist. So if we take that tusk at face value, it looks much more like an elephant's tusk than a mammuthus tusk. So, you would either have to argue that the Bethlehem elephant assemblage is a mammuthus so early in mammuthus evolution that the twist and the tusk have not yet evolved, but that is really rather speculative. Or alternatively, have we actually got two species, indeed two genera of elephants in the Bethlehem assemblage, that there is both the early mammoth and the tusk representing an early elephas? I don't know. It seems a bit unparsimonious, but that's what the data seems to be suggesting at the moment. So we do need to get both of these genera out of Africa at about this time, because the earliest mammuthus appears in Europe by about 3.5 million in Romania, and we have the earliest elephants in the Siwaliks, the Tatrot formation of the Siwaliks, at about at the same time, about 3.5 to 3 million years ago. So we do have to get both of these out of Africa around that time. Bethlehem is apparently about the right age, so it's not impossible that they are both there. Right, so here comes the entirely, extremely dangerous part of my talk, especially since I'm not even a paleoanthropologist at all. But anyhow, I showed you the pictures of the artifacts. I've mentioned the mysterious missing, apparently worked bones from the site. If there were any trace of human action in this site, and if this site is between 3 and 4 million years ago, then if this is correct, we're pre-Homo, and what is around potentially at that time is Kenyanthropus and Australopithecus afarensis. And shoot me down in flames, please, but Australopithecus afarensis is from here, Bethlehem is here. It's not that far. And the elephant that I described as the one closest to the Bethlehem elephant, I called it Hadar type, that's what Bill Sanders, Robert specialist, called it, is from the same site as Australopithecus afarensis. So the elephants could make it ... And people have all different kinds of reasons for hoping that a site has got archaeological presence in it, as you see there, which we found in the archives. So, thanks very much.